11th chapter. And if you'll remember last week, we were talking about the theme in the 11th chapter was kind of the rejection of the true kings. And the first three verses that we talked about was kind of announcing that there was going to be doom to come. And as we go through this chapter, we're going to see that the doom did come. And of course, anything that God says is going to happen, is you can count on it. That's going to happen. This was a couple of these verses that we'll talk about are pretty interesting because there are several historical events that Zechariah could be referring to, and it's kind of interesting to see, and we'll talk about when we get to it. But one of the verses we're going to talk about, there was 40 different interpretations to what it said. So we'll talk about that when we get to it. So before we go any further, I'd like to repeat, if you would be in minds in prayer.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity we have this morning to be here together to study your word. We ask that you be with David and the other teachers as they present their lessons, that those things that they say will be something that we can add to our lives and improve them. We thank you, Father, for just allowing us to be here. These things we ask in your Son's name. Amen.
Okay, so just kind of to review the first three verses, it pretty much talks about setting up the situation and kind of letting the people know what doom was going to look like. And he used a lot of metaphors and allusions to things that those people in that day would understand, and he used a lot of geographic type things. And obviously, I think those people pretty much understood the situation when you were talking about Lebanon and the oaks and all the trees and all that type of thing, that the destruction would come. So let's pick up with verse 4, because we only got a couple verses in that last week. So here we're talking about the fate of the good shepherd, and this is going to be verses 4 through 14. And the reason for the devastation of the people and the land is because they rejected the shepherd or the king. And this is kind of foretelling of the rejection of Jesus, the Messiah. Of course, we know that in the Old Testament there were lots of references and predictions of Jesus, and Zechariah obviously had several of those. So the Lord would he was going to give his people another good leader, but they were going to reject this leader, which he refers to kind of here as the good shepherd. And that was what he was providing them for their comfort and for their leadership and for their benefit. But because of the hardness of their hearts, they weren't going to go along with it. So let's start with verse 4. It's for so says Jehovah my God, feed the flock of slaughter. So God here is instructing Zechariah, the prophet, to present himself as a shepherd. And he's going to basically assign him a kind of like a pasture. He's going to assign him a flock, but this is going to be a flock that was going to be doomed to slaughter. Now, this may have meant that the prophet was to act out kind of like a skit for the audience there, or kind of put on tell a story, or maybe even tell like a parable to these people. But it seems more likely in view that what follows is that Zechariah spoke for God, and sometimes as the Messiah, as though he were the shepherd. But it's kind of hard to tell exactly where he was going with this. But the message is absolutely clear. So he seems to have been presenting an allegory that was the product of this vision that he had. So moving on to verse 5, it says, those buying them kill them and hold themselves not guilty, and those who sell them say, blessed Jehovah, for I am rich, and their shepherds do not pity them. So those who bought the shepherd would basically, they would buy them, and then they would slay them and then they would go unpunished for the things that they had done. And this was bad. And if you look at this in the original Hebrew, this was in the feminine sense. So the sheep that we're talking about here would be the female sheep. And those weren't the sheep that were intended for butchering. Those were the sheep that were intended for breeding. Because unknown to some people in our society today, male sheep can't have babies. And some people really have a concept that can happen, but we all know that that can't. And so the thing that we see here is that we're talking about the female sheep. So the butchers here kind of represent the foreign rulers who were going to take over Israel. They were going to persecute them, and they either were not going to be paying the full penalty, or they haven't paid the full penalty up to this point. And we can see lots of situations like that in history where it looks like that the person doing the persecution is going to get away scot-free, but in the end they come to a bad end, and that's what's going to happen here. We've seen this time and time in the Old Testament where God has used a nation to punish his people, and then in the end that nation is going to be punished also. So even though it looks like they're going to get away with it scot-free, in the end they're not going to be able to do it. Now God had prophesied, through Abraham, that he was going to make the children of Israel a great nation. We can read about that in Genesis 12, 2 and 3. And those who sold the sheep were Israel's former rulers and leaders who by their sins had set the people up for a divine judgment by a foreigner. They had poor leadership, and they followed these leaders, and the leaders' motives were not pure. Their motives were self-serving, and they weren't really looking out for the children of Israel. They were looking out for themselves, and as a result of that, the judgment came because of the foreigners who came in and conquered the children of Israel. Comments about those verses? All right, let's move on to verse 6. For I will never again pity the people of Israel, says Jehovah, but lo, I will make the men come out, each one into his neighbor's hand and into his king's hand, and they shall strike the land, and I will not deliver out of their hand. So we see here that the children of Israel are going to force the Lord God to the point where they're at the point where he is displeasure with the things that they have done. And this displeasure that God has for the children of Israel is going to be the reason that they're going to be in misery. And it says here he will no longer take pity on them. So this group that he's talking about, they're in for it. Now that doesn't necessarily mean, and we know that God's pity, he always pities us because we're pitiful, and he doesn't spare the punishment on these people, but later on we know that he is going to let the children of Israel come out of it because they come back to him. So this is not a complete and total and everlasting lack of pity. It's just going to be a temporary thing. So he would cause the men of Israel to become dependent on other powers. Now, a lot of the scholars seems to think that since he's pointing to the Messiah, Jesus, he's talking here about the Roman Empire, and it may be another king, but it's obviously some type of foreign despot. And when you look at the history of the Roman Empire, there's a lot of despots that were in the Roman Empire. There were very few really good Caesars. They all had their issues, and they were definitely for themselves and not for anybody else.
Of course, there was an alternate interpretation too. If you remember, before the Romans conquered Judea, you had the Achaemenids, I like to call them
And we're going to talk about
Okay.
that a little
Okay.
bit later on.
Okay, I'll
So
leave
hold
it
that
to you.
thought. Okay, so this king and his followers is going to strike the land, but God will not deliver his people from them. So there is going to be a punishment that's going to be delivered by some foreign power. And history demonstrates that these conditions did take place after Israel's rejection of the Messiah. Look what happened to Rome in 70 A.D. You know, that's one example of rejecting the Messiah and, you know, the children of Israel paying the price. Now, the Great Revolt, which began in 66 A.D., originated with the Roman and Jewish tensions between, you know, over religion, because Caesar wanted to be worshipped as the god. And obviously the Jews weren't going to worship Caesar as God. And this escalated when they got into the anti-taxation protests and they started attacking Roman citizens. Well, that wasn't going to sit really good. Now, probably the ruler here in view was Caesar Nero. And, you know, this took place around, you know, between 66 and 70 A.D., which led to the destruction of Rome. Other comments about that verse? All right, let's move on to verse 7. And I fed the flock of slaughter, even the poor of the flock, and I took 2 staffs for myself. The one I called kindness, and the other I called union, and I fed the flock. So Zechariah proceeds to carry out this assignment that the Lord gave him back in verse 4, and he spoke as a shepherd of the doomed of the slaughter. So that's the children of Israel and the ones who were going to be afflicted. So this represents Israel's shepherd, and then their ultimate shepherd being the Messiah, because obviously Jesus was, you know, he was afflicted, and, you know, even in the New Testament it talks about as a sheep that was led to the slaughter. So we see here that the shepherd had 2 staffs. One of them favor, and in the Hebrew that means pleasantness and graciousness, and the other one union, which means binding together or a unifier. So this represented God's blessing and the unity of the flock. Now Ezekiel talks about a similar situation in the 37th chapter, starting with verse 15 and going through several verses. But in verse 16 it says, And thou son of man, take thee 1 stick and write upon it for Judah and for the children of Israel his companions. Then take another stick and write upon it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and for all the house of Israel his companions. So, you know, we're talking here about the staffs that a shepherd had, and each one of those staffs that the shepherd had, it had a particular use, and it was shaped a particular way. So, you know, the eastern shepherd back in that time carried a rod and a stout club that was hewn from a tree to beat away the wild beast that would be attacking the sheep. And then they also had a hooked type of staff that was for retrieving the sheep from different places. You know, you go out there and you get it around their neck and you pull them back from places where you would really want to go. So, you know, according to a Canaanite legend, the god of Baal was given 2 clubs. One was named Driver and one was named Chaser, to battle off the dark deities of the sea. So this rod and staff is something that these people would relate to, because it was a common thing that the shepherds of that time had. And, you know, Zechariah was kind of giving each one of the staffs a spiritual type of meaning. So it's appropriate that God's messenger is given the staff to guide the people instead of a club for fighting. You know, it's a whole lot easier to lead them than it is to beat them. So, you know, that's kind of what the reference is here. Comments about that verse. All right, let's move on to verse 8. I also cut off 3 shepherds, one in 1 month, and my soul was impatient with them, and their soul also despised me. This is the verse right here that has confounded even the best scholar. And it's probably one of the most talked about scriptures and verses in the Old Testament. Now, I did not go and look up 40 different interpretations. I'm going to take the word of the people that have actually done the research on this. But there are 40 different interpretations that you can find in the commentaries for this particular verse. Now, Zechariah, as God's representative, did away with 3 shepherds that had been leading his flock within the first month that he took charge of the sheep. Now, this did not literally happen. This is an illusion here. Now, at the very least, Zechariah's action, prefigured that of the Messiah in taking over the leadership of his flock from other leaders of Israel who did not appreciate his leadership. So, there were leaders there who were not good leaders, but they were leading the flock. And these leaders had to be eliminated so that the children of Israel could be, led properly and redeemed from all the problems that these other 3 leaders has caused. Now, those shepherds were or will be as much the subject of debate. Now, there is a certain group that thinks that the 3 shepherds mean the Maccabees, the Judas, Jonathan, and Simon. There's others, the wicked high priest, Jason, Alchemist, and Menielus, whatever. There's others that, there's a whole big list here, and I'm not going to go through all of them. Bill, you want to make your comment now?
No, of course, before the Romans came, you had the Acmenids. The
Mhm.
Acmenids were the offshoots of the Alexander the Great. Remember, he divided among his 3 top generals the kingdoms that they had
Conquered.
taken.
Mhm.
And one of them, of course, was what I would call it Greater Syria,
Mm-hmm.
right above Judea. And they came down and fought and conquered. Of course, the Maccabees fought against them.
Mm-hmm.
And at this time of the year, you hear about Hanukkah. Hanukkah is all about the Maccabees fighting the Acmenids.
Right.
It's and that was a greater threat immediately to God's people before the Romans.
Right. And one of the things that was, and I've got in my notes here, and you're doing great on this, is there's not a lot of really good history of the Jewish history between 350 and 200 BC. And that's kind of the time we're talking about here. And there's not a lot of real good, good history about it. So go on.
I'm going to say, Josephus is obviously a good
Reference.
a good reference for the simple fact that his intent in the 1st century, 2nd century, was to give a history of his people, the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And so he gets into it a little bit.
Mm-hmm. So in a more general way of looking at this, some of the scholars are not talking specific people, but they're talking about groups of people. So another possible reference here would be the priesthood, and then the dictatorship that you had with the scribes and the Pharisees, and then in the end the Sanhedrin and all these little smaller councils. Because if you think about this, by the time that Jesus came along, every one of these were corrupt, and the longer that it went, the more corrupt it got. And of course, these were all annihilated by the Roman conquest. There's another group, and I think this is kind of fascinating here, and if you go back to Roman history, there's others that feel like that these are the 3 false Caesars who succeeded Nero, Galba, Ortho, and Vitellius. They were all put to death by their own subjects. Nero was bad, but these 3 were even worse than Nero was. And these 3 the problems that they caused in about between, say, 9 and 13, 14 months, almost brought down the Roman Empire. And they were so bad, and they were basically usurpers to the throne, and if you look at the history of the thing, Rome had already sent the legions toward Jerusalem and to destroy it, and they actually had to bring back Vitellius, which was the leader of the legions. It was such a mess in Rome, they had to bring him back from the war, and that's how Titus ended up conquering the Jewish Empire, because he was Vitellius' son, and he was put in charge of the legions to finish off the job, because Vitellius had to go back and, it wasn't Vitellius, it was, I can't remember his name, but anyway, he had to come back and clean the mess up in Rome.
And that wasn't the first time that happened.
That's right.
There are other times that they
Yeah, I mean, the Romans were a great empire, but they had all kinds of problems keeping it together. Yeah, and I mean, and what brought them down is they just expanded their empire to the point where they couldn't control it, and that's what brought them down. Now, there's others that feel like this is John, Simon, and Eleazar, the three leaders of the factions in the Jewish war, which Bill was kind of talking about there a little bit. Now, some commentators identify specific kings. Others talk about Jewish kings and Gentile kings who failed the Lord and were basically all set aside. But when it was all brought to a head, it was in 70 A.D. on the siege of Jerusalem. And there's kind of a reference, I think, in this to what happened then in a couple other verses. So I mean, this goes on and on and on. In Luke 9 and 22, the reference is particularly significant, since there Jesus named these three groups of leaders as those who would reject him. And we've always said that sometimes the Bible is its best commentary on itself. In Luke 9 and 22, it says, saying, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be slain and be raised the third day. So there could be the key to what Zechariah is talking about right there. The elders, the chief priests, and the scribes could be the three that were being talked about there. The other interesting thing that's talked about is what the 1 month actually means, and a lot of them pretty much look to the time preceding the crucifixion of Christ, which kind of sealed the fate of Israel. There's another view that the shepherds represent all of Israel's unfaithful human leaders, but again, it's kind of difficult to know exactly who them was. But obviously, God knew who he was talking about. I'm not sure necessarily that Zechariah knew who was being talked about, but it's obvious here that the Messiah was going to grow weary of the sheep, and the reason was because they detested him. And Jesus was detested by all of the people. Okay. Another interpretation again is a group of leaders, perhaps kings, that are generally referred to as leaders, and both leaders and sheep. So there's a lot of stuff that's written about that particular verse that's it's pretty interesting to go through. Any other comments about that verse? All right, let's move on to verse 9. And I said, I will not feed you that which dies, let it die, and that which is to be cut off, let it be cut off. And those left, let them eat each woman her neighbor's flesh. So Zechariah, as God's representative here, turns them, whoever them are, which is probably more or less the children of Israel, over to their own fate. They've made their bed and they're going to have to lay in it. Though it's probably meant that they were going to suffer, they were going to die, and they were actually going to be annihilated. And then as this went on, they were going to pretty much devour each other. Now, according to Josephus, during the siege of Jerusalem in the 1st century A.D., the Jews pretty much resorted to cannibalism. You know, they were stuck inside Jerusalem, completely surrounded by the Romans. There was no way to escape. As they started to die off and as they were killed, you know, the food supply got really bad, and they did eat their neighbor's flesh. So, you know, this prophecy here, you know, did come true for sure in the siege of Jerusalem. So by withholding his leadership, the shepherd abandoned the people to the conquerors and their rejection, because of their rejection of him, and it led to their death, their mutual destruction, and you know, the shepherd was going to just let this go on and let nature run its course. And we see here that, you know, at the siege of Jerusalem and the destroying of the temple, that was the ultimate destruction of the children of Israel. You know, I think we've talked about this before over the years, that when Rome came in, they plowed up everything they possibly could. They destroyed everything. And all of the records that the Jews had of their lineage and all that type of thing, it was pretty much destroyed. And, you know, it pretty much left in waste everything that the children of Israel had held dear. And it was kind of a final thing. Comments about that verse? All right, let's move on to verse 10. And I took my staff kindness and broke it apart to break my covenant which I had made with all the peoples. Now, we see here that Zechariah, in this vision that he had, he chopped his staff, the one of favor, into pieces, picturing the end of the favorable care that he was going to provide. So we see here as a severance of the favor that God had with his people. And in the covenant in view here is not really a biblical covenant like God made with his people, because God never breaks his covenant. Okay? This was a temporary, a temporary type of thing where God was projecting his will, upon these people. And it must be referred to as a kind of a security agreement that he had, that he would restrain his wrath from the people. But once they got to the point where they weren't doing what they were supposed to do, then, he let that security agreement, kind of go. So the term covenant used here is used in a looser sense, and it's not descriptive of as a formal agreement as entered into a contract with parties. It was kind of like a verbal commitment, a verbal commitment versus something that's put into writing. This was more of a verbal commitment, and I hesitate to say something done on a handshake, but somebody makes a promise that it's going to happen until a certain point, but if it passes that certain point, then all bets are off. And that's I'm not sure that covenant was the best term to use here in this writing here, because we all know that God, once he makes a covenant, it is permanent until God decides that the covenant needs to come to an end. Comments about that verse? All right, let's move on to verse 11. And it was broken in that day, and so the poor of the flock who were watching me knew that it was the word of Jehovah. So the faithful Israelites, they were listening to what Zechariah was saying. And they were the ones who were being afflicted also. It's kind of like the rain falls on the just and the unjust. Well, there's a lot of times when innocent people are harmed by the things that people that do bad things do, and they have to suffer the same consequences as the ones that did the problem here. So what we see here, this breaking of the staff, was in harmony with the word of the Lord. Now, another view is that the afflicted were a group within Zechariah's kind of inner circle in society, and not the whole community itself. The people who were around Zechariah and his, I don't want to exactly say his followers, but the people that he associated with, they probably understood and could see the situation that the people were in, because God had promised in the Mosaic law that if his people apostatized, that he would cast them off temporarily and allow other nations to punish them. Now we could read in Matthew 23 and 13, Jesus talked about this, and again we kind of see that reference to the three people that we were talking about in the previous verses. In Matthew 23 and 13, it says, "But woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because ye shut the kingdom of heaven against men. For ye enter not in yourselves, neither suffer ye them that are entering into." So Jesus recognized these people, and he was calling them out, to what they were, and he was telling them. If you go on down to verses 23 and 24, he was really calling them out. They were worried about the little tiny things, and they were ignoring the weightier matters of the law, and they were worried about how far you could walk on the Sabbath day versus being faithful and doing the things that God wanted them to do. And he commented, and we kind of talk about this even today. In the 24th verse, it says, "Ye blind guides that stain out the gnat and swallow the camel." Okay, I think now it's swallow a horse and gag on a fly, something like that. Similar deal. They were worried about the little things and not the big things. So the poor of the flock, or the remnant, according to the elect that Paul talks about in Romans 11:5, are the Jews who did not wait for the manifestation of Christ in glory, but believed on him from his first coming. And if you'll remember, the apostles, they recognized Jesus immediately. And they didn't wait for all these things to come true. They started following Jesus immediately based on their knowledge of the scriptures and things like that. And, that was, counted toward them. And this was the poor flock, or this remnant that was probably being prophesied there. And of them it said that they waited upon me and knew me. So here were people in the time of Zechariah that knew the ways of God. They followed the ways of God, and they didn't have to wait for all these things to happen. They understood what was going to happen, but they probably had to suffer in it a little bit also. But they were righteous in the eyes of the Lord, even though the nation of Israel as a whole wasn't. Comments about that verse? All right.
Next two verses, there will be no doubt as to what they're talking about.
Right. "And I said to them, as if it is good, give me my price, and if not, let it go. So they weighted my 30 pieces of silver." You're exactly, Bill's right there. You can't read that and not think about the ransom that was given for Christ. And it was exactly 30 pieces of silver. We've talked about this before in some of the other prophecies. Now, since Zechariah was terminating his protection of the flock, he asked the sheep to pay him his wages, or if they refused, he would he wanted what he was owed. So he is more concerned about the making of the flock feel that he is done with it than he is about the money. He's more concerned about the flock than the money. So the sheep weighed out at about 30 shekels of silver, and that's what he wanted it as his pay. Now, this was the price, and we've talked about this before, that a slave was worth in the ancient Near East. And we can read about this in Exodus, chapter 21, verse 32. It says, "If the ox shall gore a manservant or a maidservant, he shall give their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. So, this was a standard fare for the price that a slave was worth in that particular situation. So, their acts was a kind of a shameless and insulting as the general reaction to his ministry as a whole event. These people rejected the things that Zechariah was telling them. And, it was insulting, to him and to the things that he said. And if it was insulting to him, who was it also insulting to? It was insulting to God, because God was the one that gave him, the message. So to offer him this wage was far worse than simply outward rejection. They were treating basically Zechariah, like he was a slave. And of course, we can see in Matthew 26 and 15, what will you give me and I will betray him? And they appointed to him 30 pieces of silver. We're talking about Judas here. Okay, Judas sold out Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. So in essence, Judas only saw Jesus as worth nothing more than a slave. So this was equivalent of telling the shepherd that they could buy a dead slave who would be just as useful to them as he had been. Basically, what's a dead slave worth? Not worth anything. And that's basically what they were telling Zechariah here, that all these things that he was saying wasn't worth anything to them. So this response shows how unworthy the people were of the care and the message that God was giving them through Zechariah. Comments about that verse? All right, let's see if we can squeeze one more in here. Let's look at verse 13. And Jehovah said to me, throw it to the potter, the magnificent price at which I was valued by them. And I took 30 pieces of silver and threw them to the potter in the house of Jehovah. So the Lord instructed Zechariah to throw the 30 shekels of silver to the potter, since it was sarcastically, a handsome amount. Zechariah called this magnificent. It wasn't magnificent. He was just being a smart aleck. This is wonderful. It wasn't wonderful. He was being sarcastic here. So his service obviously was worth more than what they were trying to pay him for him. So Zechariah threw the 30 shekels of silver to the potter in the temple. What does that sound like?
Potter's field.
Exactly. So evidently, the setting of Zechariah's vision was maybe in the temple courtyard, and throwing something to the potter was evidently a kind of a provincial way of expressing disdain, since the potters were typically poor and lowly craftsmen. Now, there was probably a lot of potters that were closely connected to the temple, because there was a continual need for sacred vessels to fulfill the worship in. We can read about this in Leviticus, the 6th chapter and verse 28. So I've got a whole bunch more to talk about this, so we'll just quit right there and come back to this verse next week. Appreciate everybody's attention and comments today.